Welcome. I'm Dan Torello with the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. With me today is Carla Freeman, who will be moderating a conversation titled China, North Korea, and the US, a Delicate Strategic Balance. Carla is Associate Research Professor of China Studies and the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Until recently, she was also the second Library of Congress Chair in US-China Relations, which is a program funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. With Carla are Yun Sun, John Park, and Evans Revere. Yun Sun is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center here in Washington, D.C. John Park is director of the Korea project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is also a faculty affiliate with the Project on Managing the Atom. And Evans Revere is senior advisor with the Albright Stonebridge Group, which he joined after a distinguished career with the State Department, serving in numerous senior roles, including in U.S. embassies in Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, and Wellington. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Carla, for gathering a deeply knowledgeable panel on this very important topic.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thanks so much for that introduction. And thank you, Evans, John, and Yun. My appreciation to all of you for joining us for this Kluge Center discussion. We are, as Dan said, so fortunate to have this opportunity to gather you, really a set of, your unparalleled expertise on Northeast Asian security and North Korea, as well as a dimension of the US-China relationship here for the program. In the interest of time and to give our discussion some structure, I'm going to ask you all the same set of questions. Each question alone could generate its own long discussion, but I'll ask you to be as brief as you can be. We have about 45 minutes and I have roughly 4 or 5 questions. So let me start with 2 quite different questions. The first is, what is your take on the direction of the Biden administration's policy toward North Korea? Now that we're about 2 months into the administration, President Biden just said during a press conference today that North Korea is the top foreign policy issue he's watching. So that's the first question. And the second is, turning to the situation in North Korea, which just tested 2 short-range ballistic missiles, and we'll get to China in the next set of questions. What was the goal of that test? Was it aimed principally at getting American attention, or does it relate to other factors such as internal developments in North Korea? So Evans, I think I'll turn to you first, and then I'll turn to John and Yun.
Sure, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues and to have an opportunity to have this dialogue. In terms of President Biden's comments today and the overall arc, if you will, of U.S.-North Korea policy. Obviously, the policy is still under review. We're still early on in the administration. But I think we have a team of experienced veterans working on this important policy issue in Washington, many of whom I've worked with very closely over the years. And I expect that they will be wrapping up their work fairly quickly. And I think one of the most important things about their efforts in terms of this policy review is that they're working very, very closely, not only obviously with each other, but with our allies and partners in the region. The clarity that the North Koreans have just provided us regarding their intentions, I think, is going to be a useful input to this policy review process. And I think what we've just witnessed from North Korea, both in terms of the 2 ballistic missiles that were launched, but also the 2 shorter range systems that were tested over the weekend. I think these missile launches were Kim Jong-un's way of demonstrating his commitment to continuing to develop his ballistic missile and his nuclear weapons capabilities, as he promised he would do in January of this year. They were also a very blunt reminder that North Korea has no intention of denuclearizing, a point that he also made fairly clear in his January remarks to the Party Congress that took place in Pyongyang. But another thing I think was made clear by these recent tests, and that is that Pyongyang, I think, hopes to use its growing missile and nuclear capabilities to try to compel the United States to effectively accept it as a de facto nuclear power, and to try to force the United States to come to the table to engage in arms control talks, where since North Korea would come to the table as a de facto nuclear weapons power, North Korea would try to press the United States to take steps to reduce its ability to defend the ROK. The North Koreans have made very clear, including a statement by Madam Che of the North Korean Foreign Ministry recently, that their goal is to remove the US threat. And the North Koreans define that threat as the existence of the US-South Korea alliance, the presence of US troops on the Korean Peninsula, and the existence of the US extended deterrent commitment to Korea and Japan. That's what the North Koreans are after. And they think that they can get to that goal by having the United States sit down with them as one nuclear weapon state with another in arms control talks. Let me stop there.
Oh, thank you so much, Evans. And over to you, John. What is your take on the direction of the Biden administration's policy? Do you see it the same way that Evans does? Do you have a different perspective? And then on the tests at North Korea's tests, were these aimed at getting American attention, or do you see this as serving another agenda as well?
Yes, first off, I wanted to thank you, Carla, for the invitation here, and great to be with colleagues. I want to echo, I think, what Evans laid out. It's basically, I think, the structured analysis of how things are playing out. I just add that with respect to President Biden's statement in the press conference, he did state that North Korea is the top foreign policy challenge. But I would put it in the frame of, in relation to domestic, though, if I were to do a shorthand calculation, clearly the top priorities are domestic. Number one is taming COVID. Number two is getting the economy back on track. So if you look at time and effort and political capital, what is left over for foreign policy, North Korea challenge is at the top of the list. The element of how the administration will come out with its North Korea policy review, I don't think there are many folks who are anticipating any major changes. Usually there are three pillars of a North Korea policy. The first is the centrality of sanctions and economic pressure to try to get North Korea to change its policy behavior to come back to the table for denuclearization. The second is an element of trying to deal with China in the sense of applying China to in turn apply pressure on North Korea. We've seen variation on that theme in previous North Korea policies as well. The third is to try to change the political dynamic in terms of the relationship between the United States and North Korea. And some element of what we heard previously in the Trump administration, looking at a political document that would announce the end of the Korean War, something about the framing along those lines. So we see the variation on those three themes there, and how we'll see the emphasis come out. That's the question mark. But again, I don't think we're going to be too surprised by what will be unveiled, most likely sometime next month. To the question related, looking very specifically, as we look at the landscape, and again, building on what Evans was mentioning there, there is an element of North Korea calling it. In the 8th Party Congress, Kim Jong-un announced that he would be essentially working on these capabilities. It was a long list, but right now the short-range ballistic missile, I think the focus on the technology, what he's testing, solid fuel, things along the lines of enhancing capabilities at the tactical level. And I think there's going to be more of it. And one way to look at how much more is going back to that list that he announced at the 8th Party Congress. The question is the timing of it, but in terms of going down the list, I think that's another area that we can anticipate consistency going forward.
Well, thanks so much, John. And over to you, Yun. I won't repeat the questions.
Sure. Thank you, Carla, and thank you for the invitation to be on this distinguished panel. I think Evans and John have been very thorough about the assessment of Biden's policy. In terms of the timing of the most recent test, I will just note several things. The first one is the Alaska meeting between U.S. and China wrapped up last Friday, and then we saw the first round of tests by North Korea over the weekend, and then again today. And we also know that on Monday, Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping exchanged the message committing their countries to political solidarity and to political friendship to each other. So I think putting all these timelines and all these events together, it is very difficult to not to think that there is some sort of at least a strategic coordination or mutual support of each other's agenda between Beijing and Pyongyang going on.
Well, thank you. That's a great segue to my next question on China. How would you characterize the current state of China-North Korea relations? Again, as you said, China announced earlier this week that Xi and Kim had exchanged messages, and you just summarized those. And also, following that question, what's China's strategy, in your view, for dealing with the Korean Peninsula? How has it changed in recent years? So, again, two big questions, but Yun, I'll start with you, and then to John and Evans.
Sure, thank you, Carla. I think if we look at the overall trajectory of China's relationship with DPRK over the past few years, especially during the second half of the Trump administration, China has maintained a close, supportive, but not overly exuberant relationship with DPRK. Most importantly, it has provided enough assistance for North Korea, and also enough loopholes in terms of the implementation of the UN sanctions to keep the regime afloat, but without indulging or emboldening North Korea with excessive supply. So the long winter of deterioration of Sino-DPRK relations formally ended in the spring of 2018, which culminated to Xi Jinping's visit of North Korea in June 2019. And then in the summer of 2020 alone, China provided 800,000 tons of food supplies, including rice and corn, as well as fertilizer as assistance to North Korea. However, China did not indulge North Korea with the latter's repeated demand for infrastructure assistance from Beijing. So simply put, I think the Chinese find no reason to pursue further punitive measures on North Korea at this point, unless there is major provocation coming out of North Korea that changes the calculation and the status quo. To Beijing, actually, a lot of Chinese experts have observed that Kim Jong-un has been unprecedentedly well-behaved, to the extent that China probably doesn't find a lot of justification to take harsh actions against North Korea, or additional harsh actions against North Korea. So as long as North Korea refrains from new nuclear tests or SPM tests, I think the Chinese government will find this behavior relatively acceptable. And this does not deny the fact that the relatively well-behaved North Korea with the moratorium of testing is still a de facto nuclear weapon state, and China still pursues the denuclearization mandate. However, for Beijing, the great power competition in the United States has increasingly pushed the denuclearization agenda down the road and into the future, when US and China could find the practical incentive to forge a grand bargain, at least from Beijing's perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I said I would turn to John next for his response to this question. Over to you, John.
Sure. So with respect to the China-North Korea dynamic, I think in recent years, we've seen China really kind of support that season of symmetry that we saw. Among all of the leaders that Kim Jong-un met, he met the most with Xi Jinping. And I think there is that type of coordination. But the caveats, this is clearly a relationship that has a lot of history. And a lot of it is the mistrust, the types of concerns from the North Korean side of the increasing influence of China. But in recent years, I think what we see is a very pragmatic approach. And I would zero in on the sanctions piece. In 2017, and with maximum pressure coming from the US, in that period where North Korea was testing ICBM capability and so forth, China did join on some of the most stringent sanctions. But when the US tried to get China to do more, China was very adamant about essentially showing that there's a limit to how much they'll apply economic coercion. I think the message to North Korea is that China won't go to that extent where it could potentially trigger regime instability and collapse. I think that's an important tell in terms of the limits of how far China will go with respect to economic coercion. The second piece, I would frame it a little bit in terms of the road ahead for the two countries and what we're seeing. This is very much, I think, the current economic difficulties because of COVID. And with that, the current situation where North Korea is really dependent on China in a way that it hasn't before. It has shut off relations with South Korea. So it's in a position where the China role in all of this, I think it's going to be a type of coordination, a type of interesting type of developments that, as we see, probably North Korea being one of the last countries coming out of COVID, the role with China being a very different one. And so how Kim Jong-un is going to be able to balance all of that, I think that is an open-ended question.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for those insights. And Evans, what about your take on these two questions?
Excellent comments from my colleagues. Let me just add that China and the DPRK have taken some pretty significant steps to stabilize, or as I called it in a paper recently, renormalize their relations since the very difficult years of 2016, 2017. Back then, as we all remember, Pyongyang's actions and its rhetoric raised very deep concerns in Beijing that North Korea, by those actions and by that rhetoric, might be creating the conditions for war on the Korean Peninsula, right on China's doorstep. Today, things are quite different. Ties may not be as warm and as fraternal as they were during the heyday of DPRK, North Korea, and China relations. But they are much more friendly and much more cooperative than they were back then. And as colleagues have already suggested, as long as Pyongyang does not engage in major provocations and avoids conducting nuclear weapons tests, it seems likely that the bilateral relations between Pyongyang and Beijing are likely to remain fairly stable and fairly upbeat. On the question of China's strategy, I think the number one priority for Beijing remains the importance of stability, preserving stability, and preventing conflict. After all, any conflict on the Korean Peninsula is, as I suggested, on China's doorstep. And towards that end, China wants to keep its relations with Pyongyang close and cooperative. It wants to reassure North Korea that it has its back. It wants to work with North Korea, as we have witnessed, to try to skirt international sanctions. But it also, I think, wants to nudge Pyongyang away from any actions that might lead to the destabilization that is of such a great concern to China. And while China occasionally voices its support for denuclearization, the fact is that Beijing seems to be increasingly comfortable with the notion of living with a nuclear-armed North Korea for the long term. You don't see China pounding the table at all anymore about the idea of denuclearization. And the Chinese also, I think, want to expand their influence in South Korea. And I think the Chinese believe that they are very fortunate to have a rather pro-China government in Seoul that is keen to avoid alienating or irritating the PRC. And I think Beijing also shares a core goal of North Korea, which is how to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea, how to reduce support for the US-ROK alliance in South Korea, and how to undermine the rationale for the US military presence in Korea. I think those are all the moving parts, if you will, of China's strategy on the Korean Peninsula.
Well, thank you very much for, again, very compelling set of comments. As we look at the downturn in US-China relations and think about the Korean Peninsula as an issue that in the past was held up as one area for bilateral cooperation between the two countries. What do you think the prospects are for US-China cooperation on North Korea? You've already provided some suggestions with your views. And related to that, is China prepared to apply any pressure on North Korea? Evans, you addressed this as well a little bit. Again, China announced earlier this week that Xi and Kim had exchanged messages, and I am interested in the timing of that exchange as well, if anybody wants to comment on that. I think I'm going to start with you, John, on the downturn in US-China relations and the prospects for bilateral cooperation between the US and China on North Korea. And then I'll actually break up the questions and turn to Evans for the next one, and then perhaps to Yun for the final question.
Sure. The angle of looking at US-China relations from the perspective of starting off with the economic, we are seeing essentially the ongoing trade war between the two countries, and in economic statecraft, when you have tariffs against each other, clearly that is higher in the hierarchy than sanctions. And so even when the US tried to apply pressure on China with secondary sanctions, you're looking at something that was very gradual, very measured, and types of targets on the Chinese side that they were very limited. But in contrast, when you do have these tariffs going on, I think you get to see how the playbook of applying secondary sanctions from the US side on Chinese entities to apply pressure on North Korea in turn, that playbook is for the moment somewhat undermined by the larger trade war that's going on. The second piece with Indo-PACOM and the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, this is something from a US perspective, how to be judicious about what they're going to do in this very large area of operation. That is a big question mark that is playing out in real time. But from a Chinese perspective, there has been concern that this is the basis of essentially coordinating countries and almost a modern day containment type of strategy. But the element, I think, of the US making promises and living up to those promises, that's going to be a big challenge. And I think there have been promising statements coming out, but how the US is going to have a region-wide strategy, that is going to have implications for China. I think in the early phase of it, trying to get the focus on how this will affect China, there is, I think, some concern about the US overextending itself. And in many respects, if this plays out in a way that's favorable to China, it's not China having done anything. It's more of the US maybe moving too fast, maybe moving too widely. So from that larger context, if you zero in on how this plays out with respect to North Korea, I think coordination is going to be difficult unless we hit that upper threshold that colleagues mentioned earlier about an ICBM test or a nuclear test. And so up till that level, I think there's a lot of room for North Korean maneuver here.
Thanks. I think actually I'll ask Yun to respond to this question and then turn to Evans and then continue to the next question.
Thank you, Carla. I think China's posture is quite clear. Beijing is hoarding North Korea as a strategic leverage vis-a-vis the United States, and is unlikely to apply additional pressure, except probably in two scenarios. The first scenario is a bargain with Washington, which means that in Beijing speculation, Biden takes the first move to ask Beijing for cooperation and is willing to offer something significant in return for such a transaction. And China's most desirable transaction, of course, is over Taiwan, but that's not going to happen. But if there are things on the trade war or on tech export restrictions or on the overall atmosphere or the framing of the US-China relations, I think Beijing will see that adjustments and concessions, limited concessions on DPRK can be made. It will be a very difficult bargain, as what China will offer is unlikely to be extremely gratifying from the US perspective. But it is also quite clear that at the current moment, China does not see itself as having to act unless there is a strong incentive to. The incentive could also be negative incentive, which brings in the second scenario. So North Korea runs out of patience and starts nuclear or ICBM testing again in the foreseeable future. And many have speculated, what if Biden returns to the path of strategic patience, then it will be just a matter of time before North Korea resorts to provocation to get Washington's attention. I think in that scenario, China will have to agree to additional actions, including limited sanctions, depending on the severity of provocation, as such provocation will inevitably undermine the regional peace and stability. So is China prepared to apply pressure on North Korea? I think the answer is to apply pressure to do what? If the goal is to apply pressure for North Korea to denuclearize, I think Beijing is unlikely to do more because they will say that the current pressure is already there. Additional pressure is not warranted in China's view if North Korea does not engage in provocation or conduct new tests. If the pressure is to be applied is for the goal of engaging North Korea with diplomatic negotiation, then Beijing is very likely to say, well, the problem is not with North Korea. They're willing to negotiate, but it is Washington that has not made that decision. So I think the devil is really with the details. China is prepared to apply pressure, but to what end? Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. And Evans, to you.
Yun just made a series of really excellent points. I think, quite frankly, it's highly unlikely that the PRC is going to be inclined to provide the level of cooperation with Washington that we witnessed, for example, back in 2016, 2017. I did a paper on China-North Korea relations about a year or so ago, and in the course of doing some research on that, I reached out to a former senior Chinese official that I had worked with very closely, and he said, the bottom line for us is that we are no longer interested in doing favors for you Americans on North Korea. That put it pretty bluntly in my view. I think the exception to this, as has already been suggested, would be if North Korea again takes steps to foment a major crisis on the peninsula, either by a military provocation or by conducting a nuclear weapons test. In the past, I would have added an ICBM test as another factor that would cause a serious level of concern in Beijing, enough to prompt Beijing to cooperate more with the United States. But I think today it's an open question about whether the Chinese would in fact object to an ICBM test by the North Koreans, especially if the DPRK was smart enough to conduct the test under the guise of a satellite launch and make the peaceful uses of space argument, which the Chinese might actually buy, cynically, but they might buy it. So unless Pyongyang does something that would bring the potential for conflict to China's doorstep, I think it's highly unlikely that Beijing is going to take any steps to apply pressure on the North Korean regime, including in the form of additional sanctions. And perhaps the most we should expect from Beijing, realistically speaking, is perhaps a willingness by the Chinese to quietly nudge and urge Pyongyang to behave more responsibly, but I don't see it going further than that.
Thank you. Actually anticipated my next question, which was to just return to the question of sanctions, whether Beijing would, under what circumstances, Beijing might be prepared to support additional UN Security Council sanctions. I'll just ask John and then Yun to comment, since Evans has already shared some of his perspectives. And then Evans, if you'd like to add anything to your previous remarks, I'll invite you to do that too.
So I think on the sanctions piece, it's fascinating how it's playing out right now, because not only have we seen traditionally the U.S. apply the sanctions, both U.S. sanctions and then coordinating and supporting through the UN Security Council resolution sanctions. We've now seen China apply its own economic pressure, not only on North Korea, but against South Korea, against Australia, against Vietnam, a number of other countries in Southeast Asia. And so I think when you look at the playbook of economic sanction, the point I would make here is that the U.S. approach to this and the Chinese approach. The U.S. approach is very much about the rules, making sure that it is legitimized, the coordination of it, and the infrastructure around implementing sanctions, both the public and private sector side in the respective countries. The Chinese approach is very interesting in the sense that you're looking more at disciplinary actions, where the way that they're applied and the way that can be lifted is stark contrast to the U.S. approach. And I think with this, the opportunity for China to apply their own version of sanctions and these almost economic disciplinary measures, we'll see more of that. As it plays out with respect to the North Korea piece and the sanctions, already we've seen the evasion going on, the accumulated learning, and that's not the surprise. That is to be anticipated. The key part here is how the North Korean entities have been evading. The majority of it is migrating into the Chinese marketplace as well as Southeast Asia. Malaysia just extradited to the United States a North Korean individual who had been doing a lot of the business on behalf of the North Korean regime. And I think with that, you get to see how these networks have been spreading, and largely because of the application of sanctions. Sanctions have gotten better on the US side. They are more targeted, they're more potent. And in the marketplace, that has created a mechanism where those that are scared off by them don't want to have anything to do with North Korean entities. But there are the risk-accepting ones and the local partners that have figured out how to monetize that risk. That has been very convenient and very helpful to the North Koreans. So this is, I think, what we're contending with. But the bottom line here is that some of the more sophisticated North Korean procurement and business activities are taking place and transpiring because of North Korean diplomats embedded in commercial hubs in China and Southeast Asia. And I think that's a level of innovation that the current round of sanctions, there's gap.
Thank you, John. And Yun, any comments on the prospects for Beijing's support for sanctions or other mechanisms, such as those that John just described.
Thank you, Carla. Like John pointed out, China's implementation of the UN Security Council sanction resolution has been visibly loose since 2018. So that includes the illegal trade through the border black market, that includes the sales of gas and diesel on the sea, so ship-to-ship transfer, as well as Chinese illegal fishing in the North Korean waters, based on the fishing rights as illegally purchased from the Korean People's Army in 2019 and 2008. So all of these behaviors are against UN sanction resolutions. But these illegal transactions are not officially sanctioned, hence offer Beijing deniability. But Beijing did not crack down on them either. So, for example, the public promotion of fishing rights in North Korean waters on Chinese social media is politically unthinkable had Beijing pursued a tighter implementation regime. And together with Russia, China has publicly advocated for the easing of UN sanctions in late 2019 on the grounds that North Korea's quote-unquote good behavior is moratorium of testing should be rewarded. So as of today, Beijing's belief remains that North Korea is owed reciprocity by the international community, especially the United States, for the provocations it did not engage. So the loose implementation of the sanction reflects the Chinese almost sympathy of the North Korean demand for reciprocity, as well as Beijing's frustration with the U.S. over the deterioration of US-China relations. So unfortunately, what it means is that China also sees little or no incentive to support any push by Biden administration to impose new sanctions on North Korea at UN or elsewhere. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Yun. That's very interesting. And Evans, just a chance to add some further comments to those you made earlier.
My colleagues have just made some great points here. I just add one thing, and that is our problem is not just Chinese likely unwillingness to support additional UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea, Russian opposition to those sanctions, or Russian urging that somehow those sanctions be eased. But our South Korean ally is also frequently making the case that the time has come for the United States and the international community to try to use sanctions easing as a mechanism to spur on dialogue with the DPRK. So the trend line here is not necessarily in favor of a stronger sanctions regime emanating from the United States.
Because we have just a little bit more time, and you mentioned other countries in the region, I thought I might ask if there are new ways in which the United States might work with other countries in the region, might include China, to try to reduce the threat from North Korea. And I think I'll start with you, Yun, on that question.
Well, that's a big question, for sure. I think, like Evans just pointed out, South Korea's attitude is quite critical for the U.S. implementation of any structure to incentivize changes of behavior on North Korea's part. But it is also a tricky issue because the more we push on South Korea and the more we refuse or reject the South Korea demand, the more likely Seoul is going to turn to Beijing for assistance. And in the past several years, we have already seen Beijing trying to play the discrepancy between Washington's position and Seoul's position to undermine the alliance system and try to pry South Korea away from the U.S. alliance system in the region. So I would say that the alliance coordination and the policy consultation between U.S. and South Korea down the road, especially given that Moon Jae-in probably continues to pursue policies that South Korea for reconciliation, will be really important in this case.
Thank you. John.
So it's a very difficult question, Carla, because I think one thing we have to do is take a step back and try to figure out what will the U.S. goal be? What will the U.S. seek to do after the North Korea policy review, and what will essentially paint the picture for the remaining time in the administration? The initial signs, though, the U.S. Going very specifically for denuclearization, points we heard earlier, and Evans's, I think, great summation of how there is a divergence, how countries in the region really do treat North Korea as a nuclear weapon state in practice. They won't call it that, but there is peaceful coexisting going on. And there are efforts to try to figure out other ways to make that a little more expansive and much deeper. But this is the part where if the US sticks to this formulation, one possibility is to not call it arms control, but frame it as risk reduction or threat reduction. I think in that case, the US will have more countries to work with in more of a robust way. But the two quick things here I would point out. One is the US effort to coordinate with friends and allies, really the emphasis on allies. And I think with this, there's a gravitational pull towards this construct of the Quad and Indo-Pacific. And so I think we're already seeing this effort to try to make Indo-Pacific fit in terms of dealing with North Korea, rather than trying to focus on North Korea and looking at the different tools and the different angles that you can apply to that. So that part, I think there's a requirement of clarification. And when the time comes with a new North Korea policy coming out, hopefully that'll be one of the top priorities. The second piece, in terms of the US and trying to deal with the North Korean context here, I do agree with Evans earlier about Chinese approach, where it's about the two Koreas. It's really China having a Korean peninsula strategy. It's not a standalone North Korea policy or a standalone South Korea policy. And so in many respects, I think we have to take into account what China has been doing in terms of building up those two relationships and viewing it in that context of the Korean peninsula. Because if the US consistently focuses on the nuclear issue, there'll be many other areas of a gap. And I don't think the US will be as comprehensive in dealing with this issue as other countries already are in terms of how they're dealing with relations between and among themselves.
Thank you. That, I think, is a very important point. And Evans, I'm going to give you the last word here in our discussion.
If the goal is to pursue denuclearization of North Korea, what we are actually witnessing right now, there's a case study unfolding before us in how we can enlist countries in the region to help us achieve that goal. And here I refer to what is happening between Malaysia and North Korea, where you had an outrageous act of murder committed by North Korean agents on Malaysian soil. You had the fact that Malaysia has long been used by North Korea as a sort of base camp for its efforts to undermine international sanctions and get around international sanctions. But you have now this really impressive example of a country pushing back against North Korea and not only breaking relations with the North, but facilitating the extradition of a North Korean agent to the United States. One of the things that we can do, and I think we ought to be doing, is working with countries in the region to shut down North Korean trading companies. And if we find that North Korean diplomatic institutions or individual diplomats are engaged in contravention of UN Security Council resolutions or undermining the efficacy of sanctions, we ought to work with partners in the region, allies and partners and friends alike, to see if they can come on board and begin to shut down these trading companies, extradite other North Koreans that may be guilty of some of the offenses that this particular individual was guilty of, or otherwise shut down the operation of North Korean agents in their countries who are exploiting gaps in international law to try to get around UN Security Council sanctions. I think we have a real opportunity here to capitalize on the Malaysia-North Korea example and see what more can be done to squeeze the flow of foreign exchange into the hands of the North Koreans.
Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank all of you for this outstanding discussion. What a rich set of remarks and lots of policy ideas in your comments. So thank you very much for being part of today's program.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you. Great seeing you all.